Today, what we're going to do is go over the last two steps, steps 8 and 9 in the process, which essentially step 8 is looking at the flow of the essay, primarily the sentences, but also transitions between the paragraphs. And then step 10 is just the final editing, proofreading, and then the other thing we're trying to do in these last two steps is to cut the essay down to the correct word limit. So at this stage, we're almost always over the word limit, which for the Common App is 650 words. And being over the word limit at this point is better than being under, so that's what we expect. So we have to go back and find ways to cut down some material. So in this instance, we are 250 words over the word limit, so we have a considerable amount to cut down. So we're not just looking for, sort of minor phrase and word choices. We're kind of looking to cut out maybe not whole sections, but certainly some sentences. So what I'm going to do is just go ahead and share my screen and just go through the process that I would go through when trying to do this. So normally I would just sort of explain a little bit more the principles up front and give some examples to a student, and then have them go finish the rest of the document. But I'll pretty much go ahead and just talk through the whole thing in this instance, and then including the final step of just tightening up word choice, grammar, punctuation, things like that. But in this instance, it would still also be the student's responsibility to go through just one last time and make sure all of that is buttoned up. So here we go.
The first thing I did was put into ChatGPT the essay and asked it to give me the highest frequency words that appeared in the essay, because we do have to cut this down considerably. So most notably, the top three were water, system or systems, and how. So these were some of the words that I was on the lookout for when I started editing. So I went through the first draft here and highlighted and deleted a few things. So one thing I did was just started to highlight when I saw some of those high frequency words. So I have how here, and then we have system, water, improve was another one. And then I just went through it and tried to get rid of things that weren't necessary. So one thing that I like to do when going through and trying to delete things is anytime you sort of use two words to describe something, it's best to try and just get rid of one and settle on the most effective one. So the first sentence here, I plan to major in mechanical engineering and pursue a career designing and improving. So those words, although different, are not really, both of them aren't really necessary. And so I thought that the better one here was designing, because that actually shows a little bit more of a higher order capability to design things rather than just simply improve them. So not a big difference between those words, so we'll just get rid of one of them. Some things that I highlighted in green here are related to oftentimes what is referred to as flow. And so one thing that can enhance flow is when sentences refer to each other. So we have this statement in the first sentence, and then the second sentence starts with that goal, which is referring to the goal mentioned in the first sentence, which is to major and pursue a career in engineering. And so when you do things like that, it gives a sense that the sentences are related, and not just related, but then you're expanding on those concepts as you move forward. And so those sentences are naturally connected to each other, and it seems like the sentences start to flow. So I just wanted to highlight those options and make sure we are doing that, at least at certain places. Okay, so then again, we're looking at places to delete words. And so here's an example. We get a statement of sort of the negative version of it, what something is not, and then also the positive version. So if we had room, it's not a bad thing to do, but then it also kind of becomes redundant. And so what's more important is, pointing out what something is rather than its opposite. So in this instance, it's less like a sudden realization and more like water finding a new path gradually. And so stating what it is a little bit more important here than stating what it's not. So we got rid of that. Okay, so what else do we have here? So once again, we're just looking for things to sort of delete. I got rid of here. It felt like water trapped in a basin, circling but never flowing forward. So one thing that I sort of noticed and pointed out in the previous video is that although I like the sort of water metaphors and similes. Sometimes it kind of felt like maybe it was too much. And so we get this description of the moment at the sink washing dishes. And so we just came from a water metaphor, and then now we're going into literally a memory that involves water. And then we're going to get more water metaphors later. So within literally talking about water, we get this simile here. It felt like water trapped in a basin. That's definitely a little redundant and a little bit confusing, because that's actually essentially literally what's going on is water's trapped in a basin, a sink. So I wanted to get rid of that. And then this first pass I went through was just a lot of minor changes, and again, sort of getting a sense of, in a little bit more detail, how things are connected, and noticing just small phrases that, again, would be fine if we had more room, but are a little, redundant. So in this sentence, right, noticing the effect of something and saying after it finished. It's already kind of implied that something is finished if you're going to start noticing results. So this first pass, I just kind of made some deletions like that, things that were slightly redundant or just not as fully necessary. I especially looked for parts where we had those high frequency words, right? And seeing if we could get rid of some of them, because again, it just felt a little too repetitive. Although we want some of it could kind of be a little bit of overkill. So let's just go ahead and go to the next draft, because in this first pass through, it was basically me just getting a better sense of things. So we'll go to the next pass that I made here of editing. The biggest change I made here was in this section here. So it looks like I deleted this whole section, but I actually just cut it there and put it afterwards. And the reason why I did that is because the way it originally stood was that basically we get a lesson learned here from the class, which is very general, and the main point being here about learning that there were trade-offs in engineering and trying to improve systems, which trade-offs between efficiency, cost, durability, and complexity, which is important, but there's no sort of actual memory tied to that in the beginning. And so that actually functions better if it follows a specific memory or instance that the student goes through. And so that's what we get here, right? Is a return to the dishwasher in a project in the class and a description of it there. And so then after that, we can talk about sort of lessons taken away from it. So that's the big change. Before I did that, I did, delete some things. What I did delete was this sentence here. Seeing design side by side made those trade-offs tangible. Doesn't really add too much, right? We already get the main point and main idea here of trade-offs between sort of concepts. And so one reason why this is not as necessary, right, is because we actually get to see those designs side by side and those sort of observations in this memory, and so we don't need to restate it afterwards. So that was the biggest change in just moving that paragraph around. But so here's one thing, right? Going back to the beginning, I mentioned that it's good and we want to add sort of sensory information to give the story a little bit more depth and be a little bit more interesting, but we also don't want to just throw in details for the sake of doing that. Since we don't have a lot of space, we also want them to sort of be contributing to the narrative. So here we have the memory at the sink, right? I was standing at the sink, sleeves damp against my wrist. And so if you remember, one thing we're trying to convey here is frustration. And so something like the sleeves damp, right, which is obviously not something that you want and a sort of a sign of something going wrong. That detail contributes to the sense of frustration. But then the next detail we hear is we have the sharp scent of dish soap rising from warm, cloudy water. So the sharp scent of dish soap, does give it a little bit of color, but ultimately that's not really contributing too much to the confusion. I mean, it's actually, describing it as a sharp scent kind of turns it into something a little bit negative, but, the smell of soap itself is not really adding too much to the actual sense of frustration there. What I did think was a little bit more on target, right, was cloudy water, obstructing vision, things like that. So I did keep that and just carried it over into the next sentence. Here we have plates clattered. So again, showing a little bit of, chaos leading to frustration, plates clattering in cloudy water, right? Again, some sort of obstruction of the view. And so this is sort of a negative description, again, contributing to this sense of frustration without really saying it literally, right? And so it's giving a sense of what is causing that. Here we go, reaching for one's buried at the bottom, right? So again, contributing to the frustration. The next sentence, the sink filled too quickly, leaving little room to rinse anything properly. So that again, we have rising water leading to difficulties in completing the task. But then, and here we get, I kept repeating the same motions without making process. That's pretty general, right? It's not super specific or giving any real images. And so that I felt like we could just delete as we're looking for things to get rid of. So I tried to go through the paragraphs, right, and just make changes like those. Here we have, that thought stayed with me when I started paying attention. So here we get one of those instances where you're referring back to the previous paragraph or sentence. That thought, right, we're referring to here. Since we are looking to cut things down, that is not always as necessary. And so one of the suggestions I had made previously was to combine these two memories, right? So these are actually two separate, distinct memories, but I just thought we should get rid of this transition and just make it look more like, we were at the sink having difficulty, and then immediately right away, I looked to the dishwasher and started to notice how it was functioning, right? And so get rid of this sort of separation in time so that these two feel just more closely related. And also it just got rid of some of the words and improved our word count. So then we're starting to get rid of just small words here. Eventually, when I struggled to reassemble it, right? So here we get my frustration, which already implies that you're struggling at something. So we got rid of the literal description of that. Here I already went through changing that paragraph, why we did that. Another sort of sentence we got rid of. In that moment, I felt like a sense of clarity. So we get a literal statement, right, of the student gaining a sense of clarity. But then what we have right after it is actually sort of a metaphor restating that in a different way. So you don't really need both. You could get rid of either the metaphor or the literal statement of it. I just chose at this point to get rid of the literal rendering of that. And so here we get, once again, that experience referring to the previous paragraph. So a decent transition here. They're starting to talk about how their interests led to their career goals, right? And so we already get this kind of thing a lot, and it's a very general statement here related to product design and small adjustments, angle, spacing, pressure, so on and so forth. We already get that literally in kind of the memories, and so we're going to a more general statement here where the main point is naming a specific career and company, and so we don't need the small details as much leading up to that. And here I got rid of, this just kind of seemed thrown in. It's not necessarily bad, but at this point, it's the sentence that mentions improving systems to use less energy and efficiency and sustainability. So sustainability is good, but it's a big concept. And so right now it's just kind of thrown in there. It doesn't really appear in any of the other paragraphs. So since it does just feel thrown in and we need to get rid of things, I just took that out. What I did leave here, right, was my early experiences showed me how even small inefficiencies can ripple outward, affecting not just outcomes, but people's daily lives. So we did add in that point about how the dishwashing example was affecting the family of the student. And so it's fine to sort of recall that bit here when we're talking about the career. And here in the next paragraph, we have the discussion about the mid-range goals, right? Majoring in engineering and picking a particular class to sort of talk about, which in this case was fluid dynamics. And so the first sentence saying here, I hope to build a strong foundation in physics, math, and design, is just very general and doesn't add too much, right? And so in getting the word count down, we just get rid of the general statements and keep in the more specific examples. And here in the last paragraph, got rid of shaped by what I have learned and where I want to go. Which again is not a bad thing to do, especially in the conclusion. It does sort of sum up and remind the reader that it was a combination of, we were looking at past memories and future goals, but we just came from that. And so, that kind of conclusion where you remind the reader of everything that's in there is not as necessary, since this is sort of a shorter piece of writing. And in any event, you also get those same sort of ideas reinforced anyway through, in this case, you have the sort of simile here, like water carving its path over time, my curiosity has become more focused and purposeful. So that already recalls the previous water figurative language, and then that same idea of the past affecting the future and shaping purpose. So there's just a little bit redundant here to state it again. In this final pass, I still had to get the essay down about 100 words. And so we're really trying to get into the nitty gritty here. Things like here, just anytime that we can try and use one word instead of two or one word instead of three, that's kind of what we're trying to look for. So this originally was, I remember thinking, but we can just reduce that down to one word here and say, I thought. Why does something so simple feel so inefficient? And then the other things that we can try and look for are like this phrase, until I began to see the problem differently. And so we actually get a sort of acting out of that sentence here, where we get the thinking maybe the issue wasn't how I was washing the dishes, maybe it was the system itself. And so instead of just describing that process, seeing the problem differently, we already get it acted out here. So we don't also, right next to it, need to say the thinking shifted. Then we just have other little details here. So again, just looking for more sort of imagery that doesn't add that much to the purpose of the narrative, so, or is kind of redundant. So here we have running my fingers across the plate. I could feel, so we're already saying that we're feeling the plate. So running the fingers across it doesn't really add much to the purpose of what we're trying to say. So I could feel the grit. I could feel where grit remained is perfectly fine. Here is another instance of one word for two and similar above. So I began thinking, we can just shorten that to again, I thought. So you do want to notice something, you're going to have these patterns, right? Some of these phrases you'll just use or just be, naturally what you write. But so anytime you find a phrase like this where you can shorten it down to just one word from two, you do want to keep an eye out for that in the rest of the essay, because it's likely that you will be repeating it. And so again, just small minor details here, right? ChatGPT had told us that how was one of the most frequent words, and so any ways that we can try and look and eliminate those are good. So anytime you have a list here, right, which a list we have kind of working in parallel, each item of this list starts with how. And so if you can find a way to rewrite that so you don't need those words there, then you can get rid of all the items, all the words that appear in that list of items. So so it turns out if you kind of just change the tense in this instance, then you can get rid of those hows. So again, here's another example of two words describing the same action. So curiosity, deepening and branching outward. So what turns out to be more important here is the branching outward, because it's like tributaries carrying on our water metaphor. And so although deepened is good, it's less essential here to keep in. So that's really all I did. In the rest of this essay is just look for, small instances to try and get rid of. And so I was able to get it down to 649 words, which is one under the limit for the Common App. And so once we do that, we can take one last pass and try and fine tune, not just for concision, but then also just impact of the writing. So now that I got the essay to under the word limit, what I did here was I color coded the two of the highest frequency words, right? One is system, the other is water. I color coded all the instances of that, along with I tried to find the sentences or phrases that referred back to either the previous sentence or an earlier time in the narrative. And so if you do something like this, then you can get kind of a visual representation of how things are repeated and how many times and how close and far they are apart across the essay. And so what you're going to want to see is some amount of repetition, because then what that's going to do is make the essay feel cohesive and give it a sense of flow. So you want to see things repeated and close to each other, but then also not that close to each other. So for example, these are all pretty well spread apart. You do have an instance here of water being back to back in the same sentence, but in two sentences, but those are kind of further away, so we might want to leave those. You do have something like here, right? Water is mentioned pretty close to each other in the same sentences, so you may want to try and find, a synonym to use here, because you don't want it to be too repetitive. So of course, one thing you can do is just use words built-in synonyms. Water is going to be kind of tricky because this pretty specific term. we might be able to use liquid, or the other option is just to try and get rid of it and say it in a different way. So if we look here, water dripped onto the floor, carrying a metallic smell. I studied its small components, imagining how streams of water could pass through them. So potentially you could even just here get rid of water, imagining how streams would pass through them. We know we're already talking about water in a dishwasher, so if we say streams, it's pretty clear that that's what that means. So in that instance, we can probably just get rid of it. Here's another instance. We get water 3 times in the same paragraph. We might want to get rid of one of those. They are fairly well spaced apart, so that might be okay. Here we get system repeated 3 times, pretty close to each other, so we probably want to get rid of one of these. And so these two are really close to each other, so we might want to try and get rid of this one in the middle. So this sentence is, instead of searching for perfect solutions, I focus on guiding systems toward better performance. So we could say something like, if I focused on, we could even get rid of both of these words, focused on progress toward better performance, say something like that. And so now when we look through this sort of color-coded system, I think it's pretty good at this point. We still see a good amount of color, all fairly close to each other, but not too close to each other. And so visually we can kind of see that there are elements that are repeating throughout the essay that gives it a sense of cohesion. So we certainly are going to want to read it one more time and try and see what else we can find.
So that's it. As I mentioned in the beginning of the video, I would have the student do one last final check for proofreading, punctuation and grammar and things like that. But that is the end of the 10-step process. And so if you are interested, I'm going to leave a link in the description here with a free guide that puts in writing the 10 steps. And so we'll go into a little bit more of instruction on how to carry out each steps. But then you also have this video series to see an example. And if you're interested in more personalized feedback going through that process, then I do also offer services where I take you through the 10 steps and review with you each step and go over every draft with you and give you feedback similar to how I did in these videos. So we will end it there. The last thing, upcoming videos, what I'll do is, like I mentioned in the very beginning of the series, the 10 steps, kind of take you all the way to a strong version of a standout essay. But there are still more things we could do and refine and make some changes and change up the style to keep doing new versions and really coming up with the strongest version. And so some of those things are going to be rearranging sentence style and, sort of matching it with the content. So one quick example for this essay might be, since we are using that water metaphor and talking about a lot of flow, we might try and rewrite the sentences to sort of mimic the flow of water. So we might try and make longer sentences, right? And then rather than separate the sentences with periods, we might try and separate them with semicolons and make sure that each sentence really is closely related to the one before. So we get even a stronger sense of flow that creatively mimics the content that wouldn't necessarily be appropriate to all other essays or, with different metaphors or different content. So that's one thing we might do, as well as then sort of be strategic about sentence length, right? So we wouldn't want just a whole essay of semicolons. We're going to want some periods in there. And so what we also do is might vary the sentence length of starting with a short, declarative sentence and slowly increasing the length of those sentences and connecting them with semicolons, and then go back down to short sentences and kind of vary that, right? And not only is that going to make the sort of sentences that are long and connected and flow together stand out because you have contrast with the short sentences, but then you kind of have either a river scenario that's kind of getting wider or narrower at certain parts, or even something like the tributary idea that's going to go into small areas and then flow out to bigger ones. So those are just some very brief examples of some ideas we might have to even up the creativity and the uniqueness anymore. So thanks for watching this series.